Peter Hill Explains, where I invite you to join the science teaching conversation with me about Immanuel Kant. We're up to episode 5, and he's a German philosopher who spent his life, he loved the Baltic Sea and stayed in East Prussia in a city called, I can't quite remember what it's called, but it's hugging the Baltic Sea, and he's the most famous sort of central philosopher, hanging together the areas of empiricism balanced with rationalism. So sort of the rationalists, empiricists come together. There's the romantic philosophers coming up, whoever they are, and there's sort of a shock wave going through, and I'm actually amazed by it. It's that the ideas of Newton, that you could explain anything, meant that you didn't have to rely as much on the church, and ergo people could actually think for themselves rather than rely on the church and government to run themselves. This created a sort of crazy period of trying to work your way through. So Aristotelian philosophy has been set aside, and in the scramble he's come up with this concept called transcendental idealism. I think it's called transcendental idealism, if I can remember. And this concept is that it's unlike Descartes, which is a separate mind and body. It's actually a separation of what you perceive and what's actually there, and you can never actually know what's actually there. You can only ever in your brain operate with perceptions, and I suppose working from it's two bodies of modern science. So it's interesting that philosophers or people writing philosophy essays don't necessarily know the latest coming out of modern science, quantum physics or neurology, where we actually see the seat of understanding. We can actually observe understanding. So I don't know how he would respond, or Kant would respond, to images of brain functional MRIs and functional PETs to see a possible electron emission tomography. How he would interpret that. But going in chapter or episode 4, we looked at the two aspects. So he came up with this. Look, I'm absolutely shocked by this, in actual fact, because you accept Newton and you sort of Kant's, read about him, he's inspired certain things, but to actually go in depth how deeply Christianity convulsed with Newton is just amazing. So he's got this transcendental idealism, whatever that is. I must admit I don't fully understand it. And there's two interpretations, the two objects ones, and we're now coming up to 3.2, the two aspects interpretations. And we've been exposed, I think you and I, or you and the audience have been exposed to full-on Kant, and this is these sentences which never end, and it's almost as though he's before the age of multimedia and internet and YouTube and stuff like that, and so he's in this isolated realm of just whacking sentences together with all these ifs and buts and saturate anyone's brain, but it's something which we don't do nowadays, so it's almost unreadable from our perception as modern readers. So you have to be aware of, or at least I'm aware of that, but it's just more to get the flavour of what these things are going on, and it is very worthwhile to read ancient history, to actually see, just to read Pythagoras at the start and his monad, which is a dot with a circle around of it, and that goes into the Bohr atom. So Pythagoras, my shingle, as it's called, my observation is that the very first symbol drawn by philosophers in Pythagoras, the Greeks, was the Bohr atom. It's been taken up again, and this Bohr atom, the monad, has been in the idea of trying to follow it. You get into the deep confusion of Leibniz and Kant. It seems to me deeply, deeply confused, but I think philosophers would say, look, he's deeply in deep understanding. But Leibniz, I used to have enormous respect for him, I still do. So he's the co-inventor of calculus as well as Newton. This is the ability to take a system in a very short time frame. That's essentially what calculus is. So you zoom it down, it doesn't move much, but it doesn't move much over a very small amount of time, so you can actually break down movement in that way. Also, it's interesting that Leibniz had rationally thought of there can't be absolute motion, which is what Einstein came up with, except Newton was sort of stuck on the fact that there's absolute rotation. And this is something that comes out of fairly advanced scientific theory, centuries later. So I don't know. People tend to actually look at sort of like two points of a triangle. Was it Leibniz or Newton? But now there's a third point of the triangle where we have a resolution of it, which tends to come down not on the side of Newton but on the side of Leibniz. But let's go back into this. Is 3.2, the two aspects interpretation. The two aspects, I'll read this from now. The two aspects, this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophers, and it's, again, I say it's very worthwhile to actually go into this in a sort of gory detail, and let's say that we're not going for readership audience or for you to discuss this with your friends or anything like that. It's the depths, so you can imagine a whole lot of tropical fish and beauty in the very top layers of an ocean, and you actually can swim down, and we're almost like wreck diving. It takes a lot of supply, a lot of stamina, and we get down and we have a wreck experience. It's like visiting submerged wrecks of philosophy. That's my view, at least, or my feeling. The two aspects reading attempt. So this is the two aspects. Reading attempts to interpret Kant's transcendental idealism in a way that enables it to be defended against at least some of these objections. So these objections, we'll have to go back to what the various objections were. The objections were, just to summarise, it's just absolutely silly. Sorry to say anything. On this view, transcendental idealism does not distinguish between two classes of objects. That is, the object, the perceived object, and the physical object. Okay, that confused. But rather between two different aspects of one and the same class of objects. For this reason, it's also called the one-world interpretation. Hence, it holds there's only one world in Kant's ontology. That's this system of thinking. And that at least some objects in the world have two different aspects. One aspect that appears to us and another aspect that does not appear to us. That is, appearances are aspects of the same object and that also exist in themselves. So, on this reading, appearances are not mental representations, and transcendental idealism is not a form of phenomenalism. Phenomenalism is how we experience something. Oh dear, look, just reading this ahead. There are at least two main versions of the two aspects theories. If I may stop at this point in time, this dividing up, I really should. I have an app, a telephone app, which could handle this quite well, make it much more understandable than this. This is. I'll have to tell you a bit about it later. This new number system. That I suppose you could say I discovered it, or I've developed it to handle this complexity. This complexity is mind-blowing. One version, so we've got a version that there's two physical as objects. Now this one is the two qualities of an object, and of these two qualities, there are two versions of this two qualities system, enough to blow your brains out. One version treats transcendental idealism as a metaphysical theory according to which objects have two aspects in the sense they have two sets of properties. One set of relational properties that appear to us that are spatial and temporal, and another set of intrinsic properties that do not appear to us and are not spatial and temporal. Oh my God, Father. This property dualist interpretation faces epistemological logical objections similar to those faced by the two objects interpretation. This is all sprung from trying to fit God into Newton, because we are in no better position to acquire knowledge about properties that do not appear to us than we are to acquire knowledge about objects that do not appear to us. This is almost, I could almost say that this is like talking about dark matter. Moreover, this interpretation also seems to imply that things in themselves are spatial and temporal, since appearances have spatial and temporal properties. And in this view, appearances are the same objects as things in themselves. But Kant explicitly denies that space and time are properties of things in themselves. Well, okay. So quantum physics has got a lot to say about this. The spatial and temporal description is a wave function. Now let's go back. Now that's one version. And are you ready for the second version of the second theory? So this first theory is there's two objects. Okay, and the second and the other theory is there's two aspects. And one version is the actual aspects broken into two properties. Now, in the second version, let's read this. A second version of the two-aspect theory departs more radically from the traditional two objects interpretation by denying that transcendental idealism is at the bottom of metaphysical theory. Instead, it interprets transcendental idealism as a fundamentally epistemological theory that distinguishes between two standpoints on objects of experience. The human standpoint from which objects are viewed relative to the epistemic conditions that are peculiar to humans' cognitive faculties, namely a priori forms of our sensible intuition, which goes back to Plato's theories of the form, and the standpoint of intuitive intellect from which the same object could be known in themselves and independently from any epistematic conditions. So you can imagine people trying to work this out and how they began playing with magnets. And so this convulsion, this is not written down here, this convulsion of thinking led people to do these weird experiments with magnets, which seemed to be the magical thing, which got us modern electricity and generators. It's amazing. Human beings cannot really take up the latter standpoint, but can form only an empty concept of things as they exist in themselves by abstracting from all the content of our experience and leaving only a purely formal thought of an object in general. This, I suppose, is your logic. Going from the actual situation to your formal logic. I can't remember who generated all those logic symbols. So transcendental idealism on this interpretation is essentially the thesis that we are limited to human standpoint, and the concept that a thing in itself plays the role of enabling us to chart the boundaries of human standpoint by stepping beyond them in an abstract but empty thought. Yeah, just going through this myself, I think this has an overall this is a rational standpoint, but it doesn't actually think of the people just spontaneously coming out of having intuition like Einstein did and then working his way back from the intuition. If you read how Einstein thought, Einstein's a very interesting case in this. So reading Einstein's papers are really fascinating to read, and Einstein's commentary on how he actually thought. So he says he's a rationalist, and he would think about all these different possibilities, and he'd let the possibilities interact with each other, and the rain would eventually refine to one single drop coming down. So he eliminated all these thoughts. So he's really operating in this empty thought space, but connecting it back into experience. That's my view, having read Einstein. One criticism of this epistemological version of the two aspects theory is that it avoids the objection to other interpretations by attributing to Kant a more limited project than the text of the critique warrants. There are passages that support this reading, but there are also many passages in both editions of the critique in which Kant describes appearances as representations in the mind, and which his distinction between appearances and things themselves is given not only to epistemological but metaphysical significance. It is unclear whether all of these texts admit a single consistent interpretation. My quite honest feeling is that this is important in this time in terms of understanding the interaction between Christianity and science, and how it's actually pushed science in these new directions as people are all questioning it. Very interesting, but a lot of these questions are really answered or informed by our modern science, which can actually do brain scans and see how images are held. Back then, I don't think they didn't have nerves. They didn't understand the actual structure of the brain or anything like that. 15 minutes or 16 minutes, that ends this reading, and I'll get on to the next section, which is called the Transcendental Deduction. Wow, number 4. I'll just speak with you soon. Another podcast, another story comes to a close. It's been a pleasure sharing this moment in time with you. May you discover truly amazing things, understand them, and tell others. Thanks for listening.